topic of this video is Graphing Transformation Techniques Overview. Alright, here are the last three problems. F of x equals x squared becomes this. So what are the transformations we see? Let's check for horizontal shifts first. That would be adding or subtracting inside close to x, which we see here represented by this -2. So we have a horizontal shift right 2. Okay, next we check for stretching and shrinking. That would be multiplication by a positive number. So this right here is a positive 1/2, and this right here is a -1. So those are really two different numbers combined into one number. The 1/2 part is a stretch or shrink, and the -1 part is a reflection. Okay, so this 1/2 is outside far from x, which makes this a vertical. The fact that it's multiplying by a number makes it a shrink or stretch, and the fact that it's less than 1 makes it a shrink. All right, there we go, a vertical shrink. All right, next we're looking for multiplication by negatives. And we see that right here. So this is indicative of some sort of a reflection. This negative is outside far from x, so that makes this a vertical reflection. And then finally, we're checking for vertical shifts. Vertical shifts is adding and subtracting outside far from x, which is indicative of this -3 here. So that is a vertical shift up 3. Okay, great. So we found all 4 transformations for this problem. We're ready to move on to the next one. With this next one, it might make it a little bit easier to swap the order of these two terms. Another way to write this would be -f of -x plus 3. The fact that these are equal to each other makes the problem just a little bit easier to see the transformations. Okay, let's go through it together. So, horizontal shifts, we're looking for adding or subtracting inside close to x. We don't have any of that. Stretches or shrinks, we're looking for multiplication by a positive number. We don't have any of that. Reflections, we have 2 of. That and that. So, one of our reflections is inside close to x, and the other is outside far from x. So we have both a horizontal and a vertical reflection. And then finally, we're looking for vertical shifts. That's adding or subtracting outside far from x, which we have here. So we have a vertical shift up 3. All right, and that brings us to the last problem. And with this one, we're first going to look for horizontal shift, adding or subtracting inside close to x. We have none. Next, we look for stretching or shrinks. That's multiplication by a positive value, which we have here. This is inside close to x, which makes this a horizontal. And then to determine if it's a stretch or a shrink, we have to remember that horizontal is the reverse of what you would expect. So 1/6 being less, you would think is a shrink, but it's actually a stretch. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the coordinates. For each one of these transformations, we have to identify which coordinates change and how. An important rule to remember is that for horizontal, it's always x, and for vertical, it's always y. All right, so here we go. Horizontal, so that's a change in x. And since we're going to the right, the x coordinates add 2. All right, next, vertical shrink. Well, if it's vertical, then that's going to affect the y coordinates. And for a vertical stretch or shrink, we take the y coordinates and we multiply them by the value. So y coordinates times 1/2. Next, vertical reflection. It's vertical, so that affects the y coordinates. And the y-coordinates for a reflection get multiplied by -1. Or if you prefer, you can just write y-coordinates change sign. And then finally, for a vertical shift up 3, it's vertical, so that affects the y-coordinates. And up 3 means we are going to add 3 to the y-coordinates. All right, next problem. Horizontal reflection is horizontal, so it affects x-coordinates. And it's a reflection, so they're multiplied by -1. Vertical reflection, that affects y-coordinates. And they are all multiplied by -1. And then a vertical shift up 3. So it's vertical, so that affects y-coordinates. And they are all going to add 3. All right, and then last one, horizontal stretch. First of all, it's horizontal, so that's going to affect x-coordinates. And the pattern for horizontal stretch or shrink is that the x-coordinates are divided by this value. So x-coordinates are divided by 1/6. And just as an extra helpful tip to anyone who would like to listen very carefully, remember that dividing by 1/6 is the same as multiplying by 6. We say it out loud this way, divided by 1/6, but in our minds we're thinking multiplication by 6. All right, that completes the last 3 problems.